This guide is intended to provide an overview of each step in the scenario planning methodology for DESIRA. This guide has been prepared by Dominic Duquette and the Work Package 3 team. This visual illustrates the 6 steps involved in the scenario planning process. We will cover each in turn, while some steps, Step 1 and 2, will have already been completed from Work Package 2 engagements with the Living Lab. Step 1. Recruit scenario planners. Hopefully you will already know from your Living Lab the stakeholders that are to become your scenario planners. You will also need to decide whether your scenario planning workshop sessions will be held in person or virtually online. If held in person or online, both types of event will largely follow the same methodology and the same steps. You should already have a scenario question, including 2031 as the future horizon. For example, the Scottish Living Lab has the following scenario question. What will crofting communities be like in 2031 given future digitalisation? We will be using the Scottish Living Lab case to provide examples throughout this guide. This step builds on Work Package 2, assessing past and present impact. The information from that review can be used in an initial exercise in the scenario workshop sessions, whether hosted online or held in person. A timeline as illustrated is a good way to share the review with the scenario planners at the beginning of the scenario workshop sessions. This information can act as a useful visual aid to stakeholders to demonstrate change over a 10-year period, and it can also serve as a good icebreaker to prompt discussion and exchange amongst your stakeholders. Step 4 is to identify the drivers of change that are critical uncertainties. Importantly, this step will be completed by the Living Lab research team before the scenario planning workshop sessions. We will now review the STEEP approach to help with this step. The STEEP acronym allows us to cover all the relevant domains to our Living Labs. Remember that your scenario is about a social cyber physical system. So the S in STEEP equates to the S in social of the social cyber physical system. And the T in STEEP, that stands for technology, corresponds to the C for cyber dimension. The other letters E, E and P, that is environmental, economic and political, correspond to either the physical or social dimension of the future connected to your social cyber physical system. STEEP, however, is a standard elicitation tool, and this will help you to explore different aspects of your social cyber physical system. We will also concentrate on STEEP for the remainder of the presentation. The illustration on the right-hand side of the slide provides examples of a driver of change for each domain. For example, in the environmental domain, examples of a driver of change include sustainability, land management, climate emergency, and the natural environment. On the left-hand side of this table, the first column represents each domain under the STEEP acronym. The second column then asks for each domain to select 1 or 2 drivers of change. Examples of drivers of change for each domain are now appearing. These are specific drivers of change relevant to the Scottish Living Lab. For example, under the technological domain, there are 2 drivers identified, which are 1, connectivity in the rural area, and 2, digital training platforms. We realise that you may be able to identify several drivers of change in each domain, but we ask that for the matrix you use no more than 3, in order for these to be fully discussed within the time limits of your workshop sessions. You can also refer to the compendium of drivers of change for examples. You'll notice now that at the bottom of the STEEP column is the option to add an additional driver. For example, there could be an additional T. The process is designed to be flexible, but do remember that more drivers will mean more participatory discussion and more complexity for participants, so not too many. The drivers of change becomes the first column in setting up the morphological box. The other columns will be the different assumptions about how these drivers will shape the future. Choose between 2 and 4 assumptions for each driver. You'll notice assumption 2 is also known as BAU, which stands for business as usual, and we will cover this shortly. Assumptions explore how the drivers of change may plausibly affect the future. We will try to develop two future narratives, one in which digitalization leads to a better but not best case scenario, and another narrative in which it leads to a worse but not worst case scenario. History suggests that the best and worst cases are less likely to occur than mixed scenarios with some winners and some losers. The overarching goal of DESIRA is to improve the capacity of society and of political bodies to respond sustainably to the challenges that digitization generates in rural areas, agriculture and forestry in the next 10 years. Referring back to this diagram on the slide, it can be helpful to think of business as usual as a point of departure, bad being worse than business as usual and good being better than business as usual. These values are necessarily normative, so we recommend making value judgments based on DESIRA's terms of reference. For example, what is considered both good and bad in DESIRA terms, and you can refer back to the project's mission statement if you wish. We'll now go through the creation of our morphological box. The left column has our drivers of change and the assumptions next to these. These examples are provided courtesy of our Scottish Living Lab. Firstly, for the driver of change, connectivity in the rural area and digital training platforms, which would fall under the T for technology in our STEEP acronym, we have three assumptions. Assumption 1 states connectivity is high, favorably comparable with UK urban areas with 7G and 8G services available. Digital training platforms are widely adopted. Assumption 2 is our business as usual frame, where connectivity is moderate. Service provision is lagging behind urban areas, and 6G is the typical service provision for this area. The adoption of digital training platforms is limited. Assumption 3 states connectivity is poor. 4G and 5G services limit both opportunities for rural businesses and availability of services in the area. Digital training platforms are rare. Assumptions can take this form: high, medium, and low. Next, we will look at our economic driver of change, which is e-commerce supporting diversification and pluriactivity. Up to 4 assumptions can be made for each driver, as is the case here. Each assumption is plausible, and the fourth needn't follow the same logic as high, medium, or low. It is not mutually exclusive, but it is relevant and helpful to the Living Lab context. Under our environment driver of change, we have rewilding, native restoration, and the living landscape. Again, we have 4 assumptions for this driver. It is important to make assumptions for all drivers. Under our policy driver of change, we have included crafting support mechanisms. This example is to show that a driver of change may only have 2 assumptions. For this driver, our assumptions are binary, as this makes the most sense for our Living Lab context. Your drivers of change may take anywhere between 2 and 4 assumptions. Finally, under the social category, we have included the digital gender divide. We have 3 assumptions for this driver of change. So your completed morphological box will look similar to this example. The next task is to build scenario outlines by selecting 2 combinations of assumptions or future frames within the morphological box. One scenario outline will represent a scenario that is better than business as usual, but not the best possible case, and the other scenario outline will represent a scenario that is worse than business as usual, but not the worst possible case. The animation shows a blue scenario outline in the morphological box, representing a better than business than usual future frame. It is important to combine assumptions that the stakeholders find both plausible and consistent. The pink scenario outline represents a worse than business than usual future, but not the worst case scenario. 2 assumptions are selected for this driver of change, and this is allowed if this is both plausible and consistent with other assumptions. You now have your 2 scenario outlines. These outlines will be used in the 2 workshop sessions to build narrative scenarios. You'll notice that not all the assumptions have been selected. The objective isn't to be exhaustive, but provide contrasting stories, for example, better not best and worse not worst. Around 5 participants make a good breakout group. If you have 12 or more participants, you have the option to develop a third business as usual scenario in a third breakout group. For this, you will need to select the business as usual assumptions from the morphological box to form a third scenario frame. Take care to ensure that there is a good contrast between all scenario frames. The future possibilities are almost limitless, and we cannot explore all of them. Our goal is simply to explore contrasting futures in order to think strategically about the future. You have now pre-prepared all the materials you will need in advance of the workshop. We anticipate 6 hours are needed to develop the scenarios and to consider the implications. We suggest holding 2 sessions of equal duration that can be on the same day or held on separate days. You can decide. So welcome to the scenario planning workshops. You are now at the first workshop session. As a reminder, we have already covered steps 1 to 4 in this diagram, and you will have scenario planners, a scenario question, and 2 scenario outlines. Workshop activities are fully documented in a separate workshop guide with time estimates for each element. You will need to introduce and explain your scenario question. For example, the Scottish team scenario question is what will crofting communities be like in 2031 given future digitalisation? Reviewing past events can be a good icebreaker exercise. It will emphasise how radically things can change over a 10-year period and will help the scenario planners to also think radically. Divide the scenario planners into 2 groups. One group will develop your better, not best scenario outline, the one in blue, and the other group will develop your worst but not worst outline, the pathway in pink. This checklist is to serve as a handy reminder of the steps and questions you will want to consider when undertaking your scenario planning workshop sessions. This will also be made available as a separate handout alongside the workshop script. For this exercise to succeed, the scenario planners must believe that the outline is credible. For this reason, each group must spend a few minutes analysing the outline. The scenario planners are allowed to challenge and change the assumptions, and this can be done at any point during the scenario development, but it is a good place to start from. Scenario planners need to also consider the following questions. Is each assumption plausible? Is the set of assumptions coherent? And is there a better assumption that will help to explore the social cyber physical system? The scenario planners do not need to think that the outline is likely or the most likely scenario, only that it is plausible, consistent, and useful. Developing the scenario means creating a plausible narrative in which the assumptions you have made have come true. The narrative will contain details of the social cyber physical system. For example, what does your social cyber physical system look like in 2031? The scenario planning team will work together to describe this future world, including its challenges and opportunities. As a reminder, history suggests that best and worst cases are less likely to occur than mixed scenarios with some winners and some losers. Once both breakout groups have sketched out their scenarios, they will present the main features to the whole group. A question and answer session and a cross comparison will help to shape the scenarios further in plenary. The Living Lab research team will capture as much information as possible to convert the discussions into draft scenario narratives for the next session. Using the notes and recordings from the first workshop session, the research team will create a short presentation of both the blue and pink scenarios. You can use bullet points, images, and diagrams as necessary. You can get feedback on the draft narratives or elements of them with your stakeholders if time allows. If both sessions are planned on the same day, it is possible to simply give a short summary of each scenario. Following a presentation of both draft scenario narratives, 2 breakout groups will reconvene for a backcasting exercise. Backcasting is simply considering what needed to happen in order for the 2031 future scenario to have happened. Different techniques here can be effective. A timeline can be created using pen and paper or Miro. The participants can be asked to suggest milestones along the way to their particular 2031. Participants can also be asked to suggest headlines that illustrate different events leading up to their future. Breakout groups will be asked to suggest policies or ideas that, if implemented now, will better prepare us to take advantage of future opportunities and mitigate risks described in the scenario. Suggestions must be relevant to the social cyber physical system. Try to capture 3 to 4 policies or ideas. In a final plenary session, please turn your attention to the 2 extremes of the scenario continuum. Spend approximately 30 minutes considering very negative and very positive situations for your social cyber physical system in 2031. The situations needn't be from science fiction. Rather, we want scenario conditions that are plausible, but in the worst case and best case scenarios. We are required to deliver 4 scenarios per living lab in the grant agreement, and this final session will help us to collect information to sketch the worst case and best case scenarios. In plenary, both groups should consider whether the policies and ideas from the other group would be effective within their scenario. For example, would the ideas, policies, or strategies designed to exploit the opportunities and combat threats in the blue scenario be effective in the pink scenario? To fail this test does not invalidate the ideas, but it does show their limitations. Wind tunneling is a technique designed to stress test different scenario parameters. At the end of the second session, you should have captured all the material required to complete the scenario planning template and finalize 2 scenario narratives. Please send the Work Package 3 team your scenario question in advance of the first session, as well as your proposed session dates. Thank you for following our scenario planning training, and if you have any further queries, do not hesitate to contact the Work Package 3 team.